let's talk about epoxy. Epoxy is a really cool material that we are going to use a lot in our makerspace. Epoxy resin is a two-part system consisting of a resin and a hardener. You can use different kinds in different quantities to get different kinds of setups or finished products, but when you mix them together, the chemicals undergo a reaction that turns them from two liquids into one solid, durable plastic. Epoxy can be used in a bunch of different ways to create some really cool looking designs and functional pieces. For example, you can add color to get some colored pigment on them. You can use liquid or powder pigments, which lets you do some creative designs where the colors can interact and blend before setting into the hard plastic. Epoxy is also really good for filling empty spaces in materials, like gaps in the tabletop or a cutting board. And it's going to make a seamless blend between the wood or the material that you're using and the epoxy, which also looks really nice. You can use epoxy as a thin coat to cover and protect surfaces. This application is really great both for aesthetic and for functional purposes. It adds durability and can be a nice glossy finish. You can also use epoxy into mold. You can pour epoxy into molds to create different shapes and objects. We have a whole bunch of different molds available, or you can possibly create your own. Something you can do to combine all of these is you can embed objects in the epoxy, like small objects, lights, other materials, to create unique and personalized projects. So epoxy is chemicals. Epoxy are chemicals. Epoxy involves chemicals, so we need to make sure that we are being safe. You're always going to make sure that you are wearing gloves when you're handling epoxy, even if it's just for a second. You might want to consider wearing glasses. You might want to consider wearing a respirator, depending on your personal level of comfort. If you're in well-ventilated space, you're usually good to go, but you are in charge of your own level of safety. So if you want to go beyond that, you're totally welcome to. Cleanup is going to be crucial. We do not clean up epoxy with water. We do not mix epoxy with water because it will cause the epoxy to not set up well. It'll be sticky forever. So keep water as far away from epoxy as possible. Do not pour extra epoxy down the sink drains. This is going to cause damage. Instead, we have special solvents and other cleaners that are specific to epoxy cleaning. I'll talk about those in the specifics of our setup. Those are going to be available at the epoxy station for cleaning our tools and for cleaning up any spills. Again, ventilation, make sure that we have enough air moving around. You're not doing this in a small room, a small enclosed room. Make sure that you have good ventilation while you're around this. Epoxy is really cool. It's a versatile and exciting material to work with. There's a ton of different opportunities for creative and functional projects. Remember, you got to follow the safety protocols, especially the cleanup. But then once you're doing that, experiment with different techniques, and most importantly, have fun doing this. If you have any questions, drop them in the online forum, and I will respond to them as quickly as I can. Happy epoxy making! All right, let's talk epoxy station. Epoxy is really cool. Like we talked about, it's chemicals that turn into plastic. So because they're chemicals, we always want to wear gloves. You can always find nitrile gloves over here, rubber gloves. I'm gonna put those on. A quick talk through how the station is set up. Most of what we're gonna be doing is just the Total Boat high performance epoxy, and we have an automatic mixing pump over here, which is pretty cool. You don't have to weigh anything, you just pump it out and mix it, and then you are good to go. I'm gonna show you 3 different ways to use epoxy. One is to coat something. I'm gonna give a nice little plastic coat to this laser cut ornament I did. I'm going to use a mold to make a shape, and we're gonna add some pigment in there, and then we're going to use it to encase some objects. This is like a coaster mold, so we're gonna put a little toy car in there. So talk through everything. Again, the epoxy is right here, gloves are over there, refill gloves are over there. Most of what you'll need is probably just like an 8-ounce size paper cup to mix your epoxy in. If you need more than that, we have some bigger buckets that you can use, but by and large, you will probably need a smaller volume than that. Some of the other stuff we have colors and pigments in here. We have the mica pigments that are gonna look pretty and a little sparkly. We also have alcohol inks that are going to disperse through the pigment and give it just kind of like a translucent color. We have popsicle sticks for mixing. We have spreaders for spreading the epoxy around. Also cleanup, super important with epoxy. I'm going to say it right now and a couple of times throughout this video. We do not clean up epoxy with water. That will just make things worse. So we use acetone or rubbing alcohol or these crocodile claws that are really, really good for cleaning stuff up. Always wear gloves because that is the best way to keep the mess from getting on you. If you do get some epoxy on you, you, there is orange soap over by the sink that has a little bit of grit to it that'll help get stuff off. Do not put epoxy in the drain. Do not clean epoxy with water. I'm gonna say it multiple times just because of how important it is. It'll clog up in the sink, it'll solidify in the pipes, and we'll have to replace them. We don't wanna do that. So, all right. Let's just show you how epoxy gets mixed and poured and used. So for the high performance epoxy, like I said, we have a pump. You push the lever right here all the way down, and then you release it, and the epoxy goes right into your cup like that in the exact perfect 1:2 ratio that we need. So I'm going just for this ornament. I don't need much, but because I'm doing 3 things, I'm gonna do enough for all 3 of those things. Mix it, dole it out, and then show you how this works. So epoxy does have a set amount of time before it starts to harden. And cool science thing about epoxy is that it is an exothermic reaction. What that means is it releases heat. Heat will also cure epoxy, so there is a risk if you have too much epoxy going at once. The heat from that reaction will make the epoxy cure faster, releasing more heat, making it cure faster, and so on and so on. So always be mindful of how much epoxy you are using and make sure it's not too much. There is epoxy that you can use that does not have that effect happen. So if you're doing a super thick or a super deep pour, there's a special kind of epoxy that you can use that is a better fit for that than the high performance. But just for the kind of 3 examples I'm going to show you, the high performance is where it's at. All right, so I've poured my epoxy into the cup. I need to mix it for 2 minutes. I need to mix kind of slowly. I'm probably mixing a little on the fast side. You can see there's some bubbles in there. I'm going to scrape down the sides and the corners to make sure the exact amount of chemicals that we need are perfectly mixed and combined together. If you don't, the epoxy might not cure. It'll be sticky forever. It'll be terrible. And if you're using, or if you're trying to use something precious like a flower or a cherished heirloom in your epoxy pour, you only get 1 shot. You want to be super mindful of making sure your epoxy mixes perfectly and completely. So much so that if you're concerned about your pour, you can take all the epoxy that you've poured, pour it into a new cup, and that way anything that doesn't get mixed, like that gets stuck on the sides or in the corners, that'll stay in the first cup, and your new cup will just be perfectly mixed epoxy. All right, I am doing pretty good here. Again, 2 minutes to mix the epoxy just to get all the chemicals to interact with each other and make sure that it sets up nicely. Once that happens, I'm gonna pour just enough into my coat into 1 cup. I'm gonna pour another into another cup, and we're gonna add some pigment to it. I'm gonna add another to a 3rd cup so that we can start to do this coaster with the car in it. Now, the car is probably so big such that I don't wanna do this whole pour at once. I wanna do some, let that cure, do some more on top, let that cure, and probably do it in 2 or 3 pours, maybe a 1/4 of an inch at a time, no more than 1/2 inch, because that will just be too much. And again, that'll kick off that exothermic runaway reaction. It'll make all the epoxy set way too quickly. All right, we're getting to the end of my mix time, and I am going to be able to kind of measure this out into the 3 different amounts that I need, and we'll go from there. I'm going to cut to when it's all the way mixed. All right, I'm good to go. Like I said, I probably mixed this a little bit too fast. I was excited to get this out to show you. You can see there's a bunch of bubbles in there, but I'm going to take some and pour it into this cup for my mold. We'll put some pigment in there, and I probably actually don't have enough for the car, so I'm gonna do another pour there and show you how that works. All right, so that'll be for my little ornament mold. This will be for my laser cut coverage right here. All right, so when I pour the epoxy onto here, it's gonna drip off the side, so I'm gonna elevate it on something so I can take care of the drips. And then what I'm gonna do is just kind of carefully and slowly start at the middle, coat it all the way around the outside, until we get there. Then I want to use a spreader tool to get it so that it's a nice thin, even coat all the way around. All right, so this ornament that I'm doing right now, this laser cut piece of wood, has some holes in it, so the epoxy is going to slip through. I'm going to take a popsicle stick, or we have these cool little spreader tools. Both of them work to spread out the epoxy and get it nice and even. Kind of up to you whether you want to use the surface tension to keep it from dripping over the sides, or you want to get all the way over the sides. I want mine to get all the way over the sides, so I'm going to just kind of spread that out all the way to the sides there. Keep going like that. If you're doing a colored epoxy pour on wood, it's always a good idea to start with just a clear one, because the wood is going to release bubbles into the epoxy as you go. And so it's better to do your first coat with just a very thin, small amount of clear epoxy, and that way you're able to take care of some of those bubbles before you do your majority color pigmented epoxy. All right, kind of going all the way over. There we go. It's dripping around the sides. And again, this is a demo one, so I'm not concerned with this one about making it look awesome. But as you go through your projects, you're going to do that. What I'm not going to show you, just because it takes a while till we get to this point, is that as you get towards the end, the epoxy is going to start to solidify and the drips are going to start to solidify. So if you are concerned about that, you can take your popsicle stick and wipe them off as you go. Eventually the epoxy will set up enough that it won't be able to drip. So you can just let it sit, and after probably anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes, all that dripping will stop. So just go ahead and clean it up as you go, and that'll just result in a nicer product. I am trying to see, yeah, I can see in the reflection there are some tiny bubbles. Again, I probably mixed a little fast, so I'm going to take the heat gun that's over here, put it on low, and try and pop those bubbles. You can also use a torch, but just get up there. Again, the heat is going to make the epoxy cure, so you don't want it to cook, you don't want it to actually set up, but any of the bubbles that are kind of showing up there will pop as you go. So I can see a little spot in here where the epoxy didn't totally cover. I'm just going to keep using the spreader, popsicle stick, and that looks good to go. All right, like I said, this is a demo project. I'm not going to try and make sure this looks perfect, but some of the things you could do, be patient, especially with your mixing. The more patient you are and slower with your mixing, the fewer bubbles you will get, and just be attentive to it as the epoxy starts to set. I'm not sure if you can see the reflection in there, but the reflection will show you where some of the bubbles and imperfections are, and you will have a good amount of time to kind of address those before the epoxy starts to cure. I'm going to put that to the side, and we're going to talk about coloring the epoxy for our ornament mold. All right, we got a bunch of different molds that you can use. And then we've had some beautiful ones picked up over the years. I'm going to go through and see what kind of color I want. So again, the mica powder is good. We have the epoxy pigment dispersion, and we also have the alcohol inks. They're all going to have their own kind of effects. Look into what they look like, find examples, and see which one is the kind of vibe that you want for your project. I'm going to put a small amount of this mica powder into my epoxy and then just mix it for about 30 seconds to make sure it's all well dispersed. All right, so that's probably a good amount. Put it in, mix, 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 mix. Get it all spread out through there. All right, again, slowly so that you don't incorporate any more air bubbles than you need to, but thoroughly enough that all the pigment or the mica powder gets dispersed through. All right, I feel good about how this is. I'm just going to pour this into the mold so that you can see how it works. Mica powders in, alcohol ink is very similar, and the pigment dispersion is also very similar. Or you just need to make sure that it's there. So you can see the mica powder does have kind of a pattern as you pour it in. You can use that to your advantage. You can add a second color in there and kind of mix it around a little bit to get some cool effects. There's a lot of people who are a lot better epoxy artists than I am, from whom you can learn about their techniques and things you can already even say, I just did 2 little pours there, and it's clear to me where the second pour went in as opposed to the first. All right, so I'm going to pour in just a little bit more, and that looks good. All right, cool. All right, so that's it. I mean, that's for molds, it's pretty straightforward. You set it up, you get your epoxy mixed. If you're gonna color it, put in your pigments or your mica powders or your tints. Here you go, put those back where they need to go when you're done. All right, so the ornament's good. I'm going to move that one to the side and talk to you about this kind of object encasement. I'm trying to avoid some of these other little epoxy drips that are going on in there because they will get sticky. You can see I'm doing this on a silicone mat, then a tray, then a piece of parchment paper. Epoxy is super sticky, y'all, so you got to make sure to be mindful of what's underneath wherever you're pouring so that it doesn't mess anything up. All right, I'm actually going to swap this glove out because it's getting a little sticky and I still need to be able to use my hands. So there's that. I got another one right here. All right, we're back. The only thing I've done is put on a new glove and mixed up another batch of epoxy. I am not going to do the whole process of embedding this car because I need to pour between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch, let it cure, and then come back and do that once it's mostly set. Again, the whole goal is to be mindful of how the epoxy sets. Epoxy releases heat as it cures, and then the heat makes the epoxy set. So it's kind of a runaway reaction if you're not careful. And again, while we're talking about stuff we've already talked about, cleanup. Don't use water. You need to clean up with a crocodile claws or the acetone and paper towels, and if you get any on your hands, the orange soap over at the sink is going to be your best bet. All right, so let's pour this first layer of the car. It's positioned just how I want it. We're going to go like this. You can use pretty much anything if you're going to do this. We've had kids use gold leaf and flowers or like ocean toys. There's all sorts of different opportunities for what you can do with epoxy art and embedding stuff in there. Now you might be able to notice there are a ton of bubbles in this pour. Again, I was probably mixing a little fast. I'm just excited to get this demonstrated. So I'm going to try and use the heat gun some more to show you how to pop some of those bubbles so you can get a nice perfectly clear pour for your epoxy. All right, that is, do a little bit more. That is good for now. I'm gonna actually add a little bit more to my ornament because I noticed there's a couple of dry spots on there. So I'm gonna just pop that in there. Spread it out again. And then hit it so I can get rid of those bubbles. All right, here we go. Most epoxy is gonna be self-leveling, which is neat. So it's all you need to do is make sure your work surface is level, and the epoxy should smooth out pretty evenly. And every once in a while, especially I've noticed with wood, depending on the porousness of it, you can have spots where that wood will just soak up some of the epoxy more than other spots, so it kind of gets uneven. All right, that looks decent. I'm going to grab the heat gun again and pop some of these bubbles. Teeny tiny bubbles, but the more you can get rid of them, the better your final product will look. All right. You can see the epoxy is pretty responsive to the heat gun. Another option we have is a little butane torch, and that'll pop those bubbles just as well. It's got less oomph to the air, so if you're concerned about moving your epoxy around too much, that might be a better choice. And I'll show you what that looks like. All right, butane torch. Keep this in the office, so if you need it, ask for it. Just short little bursts is all you need to get those bubbles popped. Now I mentioned using flowers. You really got to be mindful of trying to control the heat so that you don't damage anything else. A lot of times you'll mix epoxy with wood, and the wood's going to burn if you're not mindful. So, all right, so you can see, I can see in the reflection all those bubbles are just disappearing instantly, which is pretty cool. There's a little bit of dust in this mold, so I can see that in there. But that is basically it. Gets rid of the bubbles, gives it a nice, beautiful, clean finish on top. Do not use this too much because, again, you will cook the epoxy and it will set and it won't look like the rest of the epoxy and you'll ruin your pour. But by and large, that's it. All right, so taking a look at my notes, making sure we're good. As far as curing time, the high performance, it says slow, we use the medium hardener. That is usually pretty set up in about 2 hours, which is pretty cool. But it's not fully cured for anywhere from 24 hours to a full week before it's really, really set. All right, so if you have, need to be mindful of that time and how it's going to impact your process. You could do a second pour within another couple of hours, but as far as it being totally dry to the touch and ready to go, you want to give yourself at least a day and more than that before it is waterproof, weatherproof, all that sort of stuff. All right. So in the first hour or so, just keep an eye on it. Hit it with the torch to get rid of any bubbles that you see, and then beyond that, you'll be good to go. I'll try and finish up this car so you can see what it looks like when you get a couple of pours in there. As long as you're consistent with your mixing, it should look like one clear solid block. Before I sign off, one thing, as far as drying our epoxy goes, anything that you can dispose of, like your popsicle sticks, you can dispose of them, or you can let them cure and take care of them later. The spreaders, you can let the epoxy cure on it and then peel it off later. But all the other things you should clean up again with the acetone, with the crocodile claws, before you're done with your process. And then to let your project cure, you can just put it on the drying rack over here. Just slide it on in a good spot. not perfectly free from dust, but nothing's gonna settle straight down on it, all right? Be mindful of your projects, take care of them when they're done, dispose of them when you're done with it, and then you're good to go. So that's epoxy. Hope that this kind of gets you set up for success, and can't wait to see what you make with it. Happy epoxying.